In the last video, I showed you how to write out an if statement, an else statement, as well as an else if statement so you can modify the flow of your program. And in this video, I'm going to show you a more compact way to write your if statements in two different ways. The first way is how to write a single line if. So let's say that we again had a variable is user logged in, and we'll set it to true for now. And all we want to do is if the user is logged in, we want to print out that they are logged in. So we'll say is user logged in. We're going to say console.log user is logged in. And as you can see, since this is true, it logs. And if this is false, it now no longer logs. But what you can do, if we just change this back to true here, is if you have just one single line inside of an if statement, you can put it all on one line by removing these curly braces. So let's remove these curly braces here and here. And now when we run our code, even though it's on multiple lines and we save, you'll notice that it's going to say user is logged in. And Prettier actually automatically put this on one line for us, which is something that I really like. But essentially, if you leave out the curly braces inside of an if statement, it's going to run the very next set of code and nothing else after it. So we can come down here and say console.log, this is after, and you can see it prints out both of these. And if we change this to false, what's going to happen is this code on the same line here, this very next set of code is not run because this is false. So everything afterwards does not actually run. And it's instead just going to run this is after. This is generally something that I don't do too often unless you have a very short bit of code that you want to put after an if statement where it makes sense putting it on one line. But generally, it's so much easier to read the code when it's on two lines like this, especially when you're getting started, because it's really easy to forget these curly braces and then not realize that it's going to only run this one line afterwards, or the same exact line in this case here. It's really difficult sometimes to wrap your head around that, why it's not running other code. So I recommend when you're working with this, especially when you're getting started, just always put in the curly braces. And there's certain scenarios where you'll see me maybe not use them, and you can kind of start to integrate that into your own programming and really figure out your own style for whether you like them, don't like them, and where you want to use them and where you don't want to use them. But generally, I just say use the curly braces. It's much easier to read the program because then every one of your if statements is going to look the same. Because if, for example, we went back here where we had this on one line and we wanted to change this so that instead of just logging out users logged in, we wanted to log out two things. Well, now what we need to do is we need to add these curly braces in. We need to come in here, put our new log like this, and now this is going to properly work. But if you forget these curly braces, forget to add them back in, now you can see that it's not actually working as you would expect. It's logging out new log, even if log users logged in is false. This is why generally I just say use the curly braces all the time, and it's going to make your life much easier. Now the next thing that there is to do with writing out if statements is using the ternary operator, which is another way to really condense an if-else statement where you have a true factor and a false factor. So let's just change this up a little bit. We're going to put an else in here, and we're just going to say console.log not logged in. There we go. So you can see it's printing out not logged in when this is false. And if this is true, it's printing out user is logged in. We can even just condense this by just saying logged in and not logged in, just like that. So now I want to convert this to a ternary operator. So the way a ternary operator works is you first put the thing you want to check. So whatever's inside of these parentheses here, you put first. So we're going to say is user logged in. And we don't even need parentheses in our case because all we're doing is checking a single variable. Then what you do is you put a space and a question mark, and then another space. And what we're going to do instead of this section of code is put everything in the true case. So in our case, console.log logged in, just like this. Then once we have our true section done, we're going to put a space, a colon, another space, and then we're going to put everything in this else section. So what we have here is essentially, if I just expand my screen a little bit, you can see we're checking is the user logged in. And then this question mark essentially says, okay, now we're moving on to the next step, which is our true section. So if this is true, log out logged in. This colon says, okay, now we're moving on to the else section. Otherwise, we're going to log out not logged in. So if I just get rid of this code up here, save this, you can see it's printing out logged in because this is true. If I change this to false, you can see it's now printing out not logged in. And these ternary operators, I mean, just looking at them, you're probably thinking, wow, this is really confusing. This is way more confusing than an if statement. And I 100% agree with you, which is why I generally recommend not using ternary operators, except for in very specific use cases. And pretty much the only use case I recommend using a ternary operator in is when you need to set a variable based on a true-false value. So for example here, let's say that we had a welcome message, and we want this welcome message to say hi if the user is logged in. Otherwise, we want it to say log in if the user is not logged in. So for example, you could think, we have a const welcome message, And what we need to do is set this equal to a specific value, whether user is logged in or not. So to do this with a normal if, what we do is we just default this, to an empty message at first. We would check to see if the user is logged in. Then what we want to do is set the welcome message equal to welcome. Otherwise, if they're not logged in, we're going to set the welcome message equal to please log in. Get rid of this code down here. And if we save and we just print out our welcome message, you can see it says please log in because they're not logged in. If we change this to true, you can see it says welcome. So we're properly setting a welcome message based on a specific true false value. But this is kind of cumbersome. It's a lot of code. We can't use const here, which is a big downside in my opinion. I'd rather use const since this is never going to change after this initial if. So luckily in our scenario, we can use a ternary operator to make this much more condensed and also use const. So let's just comment this out to see that we have it. We're going to come down here and we're going to say const welcome message. And we're going to set this equal to something. And what we need to do is set it equal to that ternary operator, because a ternary operator is actually returning to you whatever is inside of either the question mark or the colon section. So we're going to check if the user is logged in, put in our question mark and our colon here. And in between our question mark and colon, we put our true section, which is welcome. This is the text we want welcome message to be if the user is logged in. If it's not logged in, we want it to say, please log in. Now, when I save this, you can see that whether this is true or false, I'm going to be getting the correct message for my welcome message. And again, the reason for that is that these ternary operators, what happens is it checks this and says, is this true or false? In our case, this is false. So it comes after the colon, takes everything after the colon, it runs the code and then returns it. And what it means is essentially it returns it to this welcome message. So it's just setting welcome message to the thing after the colon. Same thing here, if use welcome, if this is true right here. So if user logged in is true, we come after the question mark and before the colon, we get all of this code, we run it, and then we return that and set that here as our variable's value. So this is the only time, and I repeat, the only time I would ever use a ternary operator, because it just makes writing out the code here that we had before much simpler on one single line like this, and I really like using it for this one specific use case. Any other use case of a ternary operator, I find it to be more confusing, it makes the code harder to read, and it confuses people that aren't familiar with this ternary operator syntax because it is a pretty confusing syntax. So again, I recommend only using it in this one specific use case. You're probably going to see ternary operators in the code that you see in companies that you work for, and it's okay, but again, I recommend not writing it out yourself unless you're doing something like this, because you're just going to confuse newer people to the code, and it just takes more time to read out that code. And that is pretty much everything there is about the ternary operator, as well as the one-line version of the if statement. In the next video, we're going to talk about the final control flow way where you can use if logic to modify things, and that is the switch statement. So I can't wait to see you in that video.